January 17th, 1943. Above the frozen clouds of northern France, the roar of Wright cyclone engines shakes the sky. 12 B-17. Flying fortresses crawl across the pale morning light, their silver bodies glinting like armored giants of the air. Each carries a new promise of invincibility. 16 heavy machine guns, bristling from nose to tail. A fortress in the sky that no German fighter could touch. The crews call them angelic monsters. The Germans, fliegende Festungen, but below, hidden in the haze. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climb fast, invisible until it's too late. The bombers tighten formation, turrets swivel, tracers ignite the heavens, and within minutes, one truth becomes clear. Even a fortress can bleed. The story of the B-17 began long before the roar of combat ever reached Europe. In the quiet halls of Boeing's Seattle factory during the mid-1930s, a new vision of air power was taking shape, one that would redefine the very meaning of strategic warfare. The U.S. Army Air Corps believed in a single, audacious doctrine, that wars could be won without armies, only with bombers. If a fleet of high-flying, heavily armed aircraft could reach the enemy's heart, drop their bombs, and return untouched, then invasions, trenches, and attrition would become relics of the past. That vision gave birth to Boeing's Model 299, a sleek, all-metal monoplane equipped with multiple gun turrets and a range once thought impossible. In 1935, when it first lifted off from a dusty Seattle runway, the press dubbed it the Flying Fortress. It was a phrase that would stick, and a prophecy that engineers were determined to make real. By 1938, as Europe teetered on the edge of war, the U.S. military doubled down. The B-17 was refined, strengthened, and stretched to carry heavier bomb loads, longer distances, and more defensive firepower. To American planners, it represented the future, a floating citadel that could strike any target on Earth, protected by rings of 50-caliber guns and layers of aluminum armor. But beneath the optimism was a quiet misunderstanding of modern warfare. The B-17's strength lay in its guns and altitude, not in speed or maneuverability. The U.S. Army Air Corps believed that the bomber will always get through, echoing a dangerous overconfidence shared by every air strategist of the pre-war era across the Atlantic. However, the skies were already proving otherwise. When Hitler's Luftwaffe swept through Poland and France in 1939 and 1940, it wasn't high-flying bombers that secured victory. It was coordination. Fighters, dive bombers, and ground forces moving as one. Yet in Washington and Seattle, the lesson was slow to land. Boeing engineers continued improving the B-17, adding armor, extending wings, and, most importantly, adding more guns. From 7 to 10, then 13, and eventually 16 on experimental models. Each turret added weight. Each gun promised safety. And in the minds of those designing it, the more guns a bomber carried, the fewer fighter escorts it would need. By late 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war, the Flying Fortress was ready. But its real test was still to come. The Atlantic crossing would place it face-to-face with the most experienced fighter pilots on Earth. And in those cold skies above Europe, the myth of invincibility would soon meet the reality of German steel. When the first B-17s arrived in Britain in 1942, they carried more than bombs. They carried a nation's confidence, the belief that technology and courage could rewrite the rules of war. The 8th Air Force, newly formed and untested, took to the English skies with optimism and swagger. Crews were young, barely in their 20s, trained in gunnery, navigation, and faith in their machine. To them, the B-17 was a marvel, powered by 4 Wright R-1820 engines, capable of flying above 25,000 feet, and bristling with heavy 50-caliber machine guns that could spit hundreds of rounds per minute. But from the moment the first formations crossed the French coast, reality struck. Flak blackened the sky. German radar tracked every movement. And soon, the Luftwaffe's fighters were waiting, fast, agile, and deadly. The early models, the B-17E and F, were supposed to be untouchable. Their tail guns and ball turrets gave overlapping fields of fire. In theory, every attack angle was covered. In practice, German pilots found gaps, blind spots under the nose and along the belly. By diving head-on or from below, the Bf-109s and FW-190s could strike faster than gunners could aim. Losses mounted. Missions over Lille, Rouen, and Bremen revealed that even with 10 or 12 guns, a single bomber rarely returned unscarred. The response was predictable. Add more firepower. By mid-1943, experimental variants carried up to 16 machine guns, extra twin mounts in the waist, reinforced chin turrets, and even improvised installations in windows and hatches. Engineers believed more barrels meant fewer dead crews. Yet every gun came with weight: ammunition, belts, mounts, armor, and cooling systems. A fully loaded 16-gun B-17 weighed nearly 2,000 pounds more than its earlier versions. The added drag slowed climb rates and reduced effective range. Engines overheated. Fuel consumption soared. But these weren't peacetime laboratories. They were battlefields in the sky. Crews called the modifications life insurance. The brass called it necessary. Each returning aircraft was inspected, patched, and armed with still more metal teeth before the next mission. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Luftwaffe adapted. German intelligence studied every captured wreck, calculating the fortress's firing arcs and communication patterns. They learned that formations became chaotic once a lead plane went down, leaving isolated bombers vulnerable. And so, the 16-gun B-17, the ultimate flying fortress, became a paradox. It was powerful enough to survive where few aircraft could, yet heavy enough to suffer from its own defenses. By summer 1943, the 8th Air Force was preparing for deeper raids into the heart of Germany itself. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Stuttgart lay ahead. The Americans believed the extra guns would finally turn the tide. The Luftwaffe saw an opportunity to expose the bomber's greatest weakness, one that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with physics. The next chapter explores those contrasting perspectives from engineers, gunners, commanders, and even the Luftwaffe itself. Technological angle. The fortress of metal and myth, the B-17, was an engineering marvel, a product of American industrial ambition at its height. Its all-metal frame, self-sealing fuel tanks, and powered turrets made it one of the most advanced bombers of its era. Every gun position was a triumph of mechanical coordination. Ball bearings, electrical drives, and plexiglass domes offering near-total coverage. When engineers at Boeing introduced the concept of a 16-gun fortress, they weren't chasing vanity. They were chasing survival. Combat reports from 1942 showed that unescorted bombers suffered heavy casualties. Each new gun added a layer of hope, a sense of control in a war that offered little of it. But the paradox of design soon appeared. Every pound of armor and ammunition meant less altitude and shorter range. The bomber that once climbed like an eagle began to lumber. Its legendary resilience, returning to base with wings shredded and engines burning, came not from invincibility, but from sheer over-engineering. In the race to make the B-17 untouchable, its designers had unknowingly begun to dull its wings. Tactical angle, the doctrine of the box. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed in formations. Tight, geometric combat boxes, where each bomber's guns overlapped with its neighbors. In theory, a formation of 12 B-17s could create a floating fortress. Hundreds of guns firing in all directions, impossible for fighters to penetrate. But in the chaos of real combat, theory shattered. Flak bursts forced formations apart. Clouds broke visual contact. Radio silence meant confusion. And once the combat box fractured, a single bomber was alone. A slow, heavy, isolated target in the sky. The doctrine relied on discipline and mechanical reliability, both fragile under fire. Turrets jammed in the cold. Oxygen lines froze. Ammunition belts twisted in the turbulence. The Luftwaffe learned to exploit these weaknesses, sending coordinated waves of fighters from multiple directions. Some attacked head-on, where nose gunners had limited range. Others struck from below, knowing the belly guns had narrow arcs. The fortress, built to be an impregnable castle in the air, became a slow-moving puzzle, one that German aces learned to solve piece by piece. Human angle, life inside the fortress, inside the B-17. Technology met flesh and fear. Temperatures at altitude dropped to 40 degrees C. Frost formed inside the windows. Oxygen masks froze to faces. The gunners, huddled in cramped bubbles of glass and steel, had one task: to spot and fire before the enemy's cannon shells tore through them. Each mission lasted 8 to 10 hours. Each moment, the sound of engines was joined by the metallic chatter of 50-caliber guns. Shell casings rattled against the fuselage floor, mixing with blood, sweat, and frost. The crew trusted their fortress, trusted the 16 guns that surrounded them. But when a fighter burst through the formation, when a gun jammed or froze, the illusion of invulnerability shattered. The sky was vast, merciless, and silent except for the sound of dying engines. The human spirit endured, but faith in the invincible machine began to falter. And as that doubt grew, others, on both sides of the front, started seeing the B-17 not as untouchable, but as predictable. Enemy perspective, the calculated hunters for the Luftwaffe. The B-17 was both a nightmare and an opportunity. When the first fortresses appeared over occupied Europe in 1942, German pilots were astonished. Massive aircraft flying higher than most fighters could reach, spraying streams of tracer fire in all directions. At first, head-on attacks seemed suicidal, but German intelligence, meticulous as ever, began dissecting captured bombers. They measured gun placements, calculated fields of fire, and analyzed blind zones. Soon, a doctrine emerged. Angriff von vorn oben, the front-high attack. Fighters would dive out of the sun, strike head-on, and escape downward, exploiting the narrow firing arcs of the nose gunners. Luftwaffe aces like Egon Mayer and Georg Peter Eder perfected these assaults, turning the once untouchable fortresses into predictable prey. They studied the Americans' rigid formations and timing, learning to anticipate flight paths, radio frequencies, and even the bomb release signals. For every fortress lost, lessons were learned, not by the Americans, but by the hunters waiting above the clouds. Leadership angle, the fortress of belief in Washington and at 8th Air Force Headquarters in England, a different kind of battle was unfolding, one of ideology. Generals like Ira Eker and Karl Spaatz believed deeply in the doctrine of daylight precision bombing. To them, the B-17 wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of American industrial superiority and moral strength. High, fast, and heavily armed, they said. The fortress will always get through. It was a comforting sentence in a war filled with uncertainty. Even as casualty reports poured in, dozens of crews missing, entire squadrons erased over the Ruhr and Regensburg. Command clung to the idea that heavier armament would eventually tip the balance. Each new turret, each modification, each reinforcement was seen not as a compromise, but as progress. It was, in many ways, a faith-based strategy. Belief in technology over tactics, belief in armor over adaptability. And while factories in Seattle worked around the clock to produce more B-17s, few dared question whether the doctrine itself was flawed. Moral and strategic angle. The weight of overconfidence. The 16-gun B-17 embodied both human genius and human hubris. It was a triumph of design, a machine capable of crossing entire continents, braving flak, frost, and flame. Yet it was also a reminder that no weapon, however advanced, could defy the realities of combat. Every added gun was a response to fear. Fear of loss, fear of defeat. But in trying to protect the crews, the design made them slower, heavier, and, ironically, more vulnerable. It was a moral paradox. The desire to save lives by adding power that ultimately endangered them. In each mission debriefing, engineers studied wreckage and bullet holes, seeking mechanical answers to human problems. The true weakness wasn't the aluminum or the engine. It was the belief that the fortress was infallible. War, as the skies over Europe proved, punishes arrogance as swiftly as ignorance. And for the men inside those bombers, the lesson would come not in theory, but in flame and falling metal. As the summer of 1943 dawned, that lesson was about to reach its brutal climax. The stage was set for one of the most catastrophic air battles of the war, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. August 17, 1943. Dawn breaks over the English countryside, golden light spilling across runways lined with bombers. Hundreds of airmen gather near their aircraft, the hum of engines mixing with nervous laughter and the clatter of ammunition belts. The mission, a coordinated double strike on the heart of the German war machine. See ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Regensburg. It would be one of the most ambitious daylight raids in history. 2 waves, 327 26 B-17s, each armed with up to 16 heavy machine guns. Each crew briefed to fly in tight combat boxes, trusting in overlapping firepower to shield them from the Luftwaffe. At 0800 hours, the engines thunder to life. Ground crews wave their hands. One by one, the fortresses roll down the tarmac and rise into the morning haze, a metallic swarm bound for the heart of Germany. For the first hour, everything seems calm. The North Sea lies quiet beneath their wings. The sun glints off canopies like sparks. Inside each plane, the men breathe in pure oxygen, hearts pounding in unison with the engines. Then, at the German coast, the illusion ends. Radar screens light up across occupied Europe. Luftwaffe controllers sound the alarm. From bases in France and Belgium, fighters begin to climb. Waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s slicing through the clouds. At 10:30 a.m., contact. The sky erupts. German formations hit the American columns head-on, diving through the defensive boxes with deadly precision. Machine guns roar. Tracer fire laces the air. The B-17's 16 guns blaze in all directions, streams of molten brass raining down. Some fighters fall burning. Others slip through and strike again. The sheer number of guns fills the sky with chaos, but coordination collapses. Turrets jam. Gunners lose sight of the enemy amid smoke and contrails. One fortress spirals downward, its right wing gone. Another explodes mid-air, scattering debris across the formation. Inside Little Miss Mischief, a waist gunner screams for more ammo. His partner is hit. The oxygen line freezes. In Memphis Belle 2, the Chin turret overheats and locks, its twin 50s frozen in place. The doctrine of the box dissolves under fire. Formation fragments into isolated clusters, each now fighting for its own survival. From below, the German flak begins to rise. black bursts punching through the sky, rocking the bombers as they press deeper into the continent. Bomb doors open. Targets appear. But precision becomes impossible amid the smoke and turbulence. Bombs fall wide, and the Luftwaffe closes in again. By the time the fortresses reach Schweinfurt, the air is a storm of metal. Crews drop their payloads and turn for home, exhausted, bloodied, and pursued. The flying fortress has proven it can hit Germany's heart, but at a cost so heavy, even victory feels hollow. The return from Schweinfurt was not a flight home. It was a slow, burning descent through a storm of death. By midday, the formation had broken apart entirely. Over western Germany, dozens of crippled B-17s limped toward England, engines coughing smoke trails that stretched for miles. Some flew alone. Others tried to rejoin fragments of their squadrons, missing wings, turrets, or half their crew. The radios crackled with static and mayday calls. One pilot's last words were a whisper. "Tell them we tried." What was meant to be a decisive display of American air power had turned into a lesson written in fire and contrails. Out of 376 bombers that took off that morning, 60 were shot down. Another 100 were damaged beyond repair. Nearly 600 men were missing or killed. Entire crews vanished over German farmland, their wreckage still smoldering as farmers watched in stunned silence. In the debriefings that followed, the reality of the 16-gun myth came crashing down. The additional firepower had done little to reduce losses. Reports described guns jamming from overheating after long bursts. Gunners complained of frostbite from handling metal in sub-zero temperatures. Turret motors failed under the strain of extended combat. Ammunition feeds jammed under high G turns. In some aircraft, the added armor and weapons had reduced speed so drastically that the bombers struggled to maintain formation, making them easy targets for faster German fighters. The promise of mutual defense collapsed the moment a formation was scattered. Every gun that was meant to protect them had instead helped drag them down. Even those that survived were battered ghosts. B-17 Cher Ami landed in England with 183 holes through its fuselage. Another, Sweet Pea, returned with 3 engines dead, and its tail almost severed. Its rear gunner frozen solid in his turret. Ground crews watched in silence as the battered fortresses touched down, one after another, landing gear collapsing under their weight. For the first time, American commanders began to question the doctrine itself. Was the fortress truly self-defending? Or was that belief costing more lives than it saved? Luftwaffe pilots, celebrating in their hangars that night, didn't call it a victory. They called it a revelation. They had proven that even the most heavily armed bomber in the world could be broken, not by brute force, but by precision, patience, and understanding its limits. And for the 8th Air Force, that revelation was devastating. Crews who once called their aircraft invincible now spoke in whispers. They still believed in their mission, but they no longer believed the fortress could do it alone. That day, in August 1943, marked a turning point. From that moment forward, the U.S. command knew that brute firepower would never be enough. Something had to change. Tactics, strategy, and the very philosophy of air warfare itself. The airfields of eastern England were quiet that evening. Ground crews stood in silence as what remained of the formations limped home. Engines coughing, fuselages torn open, landing gear collapsing under the strain. One by one, the B-17s touched down, many with smoke still rising from their wings. Others simply never returned. In the control towers, officers marked the missing with grease pencils on large glass plotting boards. Entire squadrons were erased in hours. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid had achieved its objectives on paper. The ball-bearing plants were damaged, and Messerschmitt production temporarily slowed, But the cost was catastrophic. For the 8th Air Force, the numbers told a grim story. Nearly 1 in 6 bombers lost, hundreds of men dead or captured, and the illusion of daylight invulnerability shattered. In the days that followed, the tone of reports changed. Instead of boasting about fortresses that always got through, mission debriefings now spoke of fortresses that barely made it back. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris of the RAF, long skeptical of American daylight bombing, remarked privately, "They'll have to learn what we did. No bomber gets through without fighters." Inside the 8th Air Force headquarters, Brigadier General Fred Anderson compiled post-mission analyses. The findings were damning. Extra guns increased drag and reduced range. Ammunition loads strained engines and fuel consumption. The box formation failed under sustained attack. Luftwaffe tactics exploited every blind spot. And perhaps most importantly, the belief that overlapping firepower could replace escort fighters was now untenable. Back at Boeing, engineers received telegrams filled with urgent redesign requests. Some demanded lighter airframes. Others called for new turret placements, improved visibility, and reduced gun redundancy. The 16-gun era was ending before it had truly begun. Morale among crews plummeted. Many who survived Schweinfurt described it as a suicide mission. The Reeds' myth had died in the same skies that once carried it, but out of the ashes of that failure came a realization that would change everything, that no fortress, no matter how armed, could stand alone. By late 1943, the myth of the self-defending bomber was gone, burned away in the cold skies over Germany. The Schweinfurt and Regensburg missions had exposed what no one at Air Force Command wanted to admit, that no amount of firepower could compensate for isolation. The problem was not bravery, nor design, it was distance. The B-17s could reach deep into Germany, but their escort fighters could not. P-47, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires simply lacked the range to follow the bombers all the way to the target and back. Once they turned home, the Luftwaffe pounced, every single time. Something had to change. That change came in the form of a sleek, new aircraft that had begun as a British request, the North American P-51 Mustang. When fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became the perfect companion to the B-17. Fast, long-ranged, and deadly above 30,000 feet. By early 1944, the first Mustangs were accompanying bomber formations deep into Germany, and everything changed. For the first time, the Luftwaffe found itself on the defensive. P-51s dived through enemy formations, scattering interceptors before they could strike. Bomber crews, once alone and desperate, now watched sleek silver fighters dance among them like guardian angels. With escorts now protecting them from takeoff to target, the B-17s could finally do what they were built to do: strike with precision, consistency, and confidence. Loss rates plummeted. The Luftwaffe's veteran pilots, forced into constant combat against both bombers and their new escorts, began to dwindle. Fuel shortages and training deficits compounded the collapse. By the summer of 1944, the balance of air power over Europe had decisively shifted. But while the Mustang saved the bomber offensive, the lesson of the 16-gun fortress was not forgotten. The concept of the independent war machine, an aircraft so powerful it needed no support, had proven an illusion. Warfare in the sky, like warfare on the ground, required coordination, flexibility, and humility before the realities of combat. In redesigns that followed, engineers stripped weight, optimized aerodynamics, and emphasized teamwork over raw armament. The flying fortress was no longer a lone castle in the clouds. It became part of a greater system: fighter cover, radar guidance, and combined command. The cost of that understanding was measured not in dollars, but in lives, Thousands of young men who had believed in the legend of the invincible bomber. They had flown into history's hardest lesson, and through their loss, changed the future of air warfare forever. The B-17 Flying Fortress began as an idea that strength could conquer vulnerability, that firepower could overcome fear. For a time, it seemed to work. Armored, armed, and majestic in flight, it symbolized the faith of an entire generation in the power of human invention. But in the cold skies above Europe, invention met reality. Each added gun, each extra plate of armor, was a reflection of our instinct to control the uncontrollable, to build machines that could shield us from death itself. And yet, war reminds us of a truth older than any technology. No machine, no weapon, no fortress is ever truly invincible. The 16-gun B-17 was not a failure. It was a teacher. It revealed that survival in war is not found in isolation, but in cooperation, in the bond between pilots, engineers, mechanics, and the fighters that flew beside them. It showed that courage, when paired with humility, builds victories far greater than steel and gunfire. When the last flying fortresses left the skies of Europe, they carried more than bombs or scars. They carried a lesson, one written in smoke and sky, that power without understanding is fragile, and that even giants must learn to fly together. And so, the legend of the 16-gun fortress lives on, not as a monument to invincibility, but as a quiet tribute to endurance, adaptation, and the unbreakable human will to rise again.